Hi, my name is Shadow and I'm giving you a brief oversight about greatswords around the world. And today we are going to talk about the Iberian Montante. The Montante had been used in the 16th and 17th century on the Iberian Peninsula in southwestern Europe. This region lies in today's Spain and Portugal. So, what is a Montante? The current definition from the Real Academia de la Lengua Española says: a large sword with white quillons which must be wielded in both hands, which only has since been used by master-at-arms to separate fencers, showing excessive enthusiasm. The word Montante means upright in modern Spanish Portuguese, which becomes montare in Italian, which means, well, to go up. This makes sense because most sources start with upward strikes like Figueiredo and Barbaran. According to a source, the Montante was 8 palms long, and since one palm was 20.8 centimeters long, the Montante would be 1.66 meters long. But since the Montante varied in length from shoulder high to chin high, even to nose high, you could say that the Montante was about 160 to 170 centimeters long. And it weighed only 2.5 kilograms, which made it a very swift blade. In contrast to a late 16th century German Schlachtschwert, the Montante had a slimmer blade and a lighter crossguard due to its more minimalistic design. This made the Montante a tad bit lighter than the late 16th century German Schlachtschwert. Talking about the build of a Montante, let's do it in more detail. So, here's the pommel. The pommel could have the shape of a pear, a fig or a ball, and it held mainly the whole hilt construction together. But it could also prevent the hand from sliding off the handle when it became slippery because of sweat, blood and other body fluids. Remember when I told you that the Montante would be about 8 palms long? Well, the grip would take up about 2 palms of length, which translates to roughly 42 centimeters of the whole length. That means the grip would take up a solid quarter of the whole length of a Montante. The grip of a Montante would start parallel at the crossguard till the middle and then would narrow down to the pommel. Some models even start and end narrow with the widest part in the middle of the grip. That makes the grip of a Montante slightly diamond-shaped. And now let's talk about the crossguard. In contrast to a late 16th century German Schlachtschwert, the Montante would feature a more minimalistic but still usable design. Most Montante would have a narrow T-shaped crossguard that would widen at the ends a little bit and would feature 1 to 2 side rings, which could also protect your hands. Some specimens even featured double rings, but they were mostly a minority. Do not forget there are always exceptions and different forms of a Montante depending on what the owner paid for, but they will always mostly look filigree and elegant, and the crossguard would be as broad as the owner's shoulders. Next part of the Montante is the Ricasso. The Ricasso was a portion of the blade between the crossguard and the parrying lugs that was blunt on purpose. Like all greatswords, the Montante started without the Ricasso and the parrying horns, but this changed mid-16th century. We don't know for sure why the Ricasso was invented, but you can still use it in a fight. The Ricasso makes half swording easier when you shorten your reach for more point control. There you can use spear techniques with the Montante. This is where the parrying lugs or parrying horns of a Montante came in handy. They prevented the enemy's weapon from sliding down all the way to the crossguard for more protection. Reach is key with a great sword like the Montante, and having distance to the opponent's weapon is always a good idea, be it by stopping the blade further away from you or protecting your hands while half swording. The Montante had few styles when it comes to the parrying hooks or parrying horns, but they were mostly in a more minimalistic style in contrast to a late 16th century German Schlachtschwert. maybe the southern style or the northern style. And the first parrying hooks I would like to show you are these. This pair can be seen on many Montantes. A pair of very pointy spikes, almost diamond-shaped if you look at both of them. Although I have no Montante in my possession, I still can imagine that this kind of grabbing horns are a bit riskier for the user, since the angle between the blade and the parrying horns is too obtuse. The enemy's weapon can slide off way more easier this way and still hit you. And this is why I prefer the other dominant style of the grabbing horns. Here the Parrying Lugs build a right triangle where the longer leg builds a 90-degree angle to the blade, which in my view catches the enemy's weapon way better. And now here comes the blade. The blade of a Montante would take up 3/4 of the whole length, or if you will, 6 palms of the earlier mentioned 8 palms of the length. Well, the blade of the Montante is double-edged and would start parallel at the crossguard and would taper gradually to the tip. Some models even had reinforced tips, which made them better for thrusting. The blade had a stout hexagonal cross-section and would feature at least one long and narrow fuller in the middle of the blade. Being a very flexible and thin blade, this gives you the impression of a very swift weapon. Now we know the anatomy of a Montante, but how were they used? Most sources from Spain or Portugal depict the Montante as a weapon applied to scenarios where the wielder is outnumbered in an urban civilian context. In the military, the Montante was mostly wielded by officers or skirmishers rather than by soldiers in formation. When the Montante waned as a war tool, most written sources like the Reglas or rules were written in a civilian context for unarmored opponents. Unfortunately, I haven't found many sources for the military use of a Montante, so I'm going to talk much more about the civilian context. The best sources for Montante fencing you can find are from Luis Barbaran, Don Diego Gómez de Figueiredo, and Domingo Luis Godinho. Barbaran has the best basics to start before you go over to Figueiredo and Godinho. These two fencing masters wrote the so-called rules or reglas for the Montante. Each rule was a combination of strikes in certain angles, footwork, and were written for certain situations a Montantero can find himself in. Like in a wide street, a narrow street, surrounded, and many more. Although Figueiredo has more rules than Godinho, I think Godinho described his techniques better, so this makes Godinho more beginner-friendly in my view. Fighting with a Montante lives from using the momentum in circular motions, with core rotation and staying continuously in motion. Since you can strike with varying commitment, it is not as tiring as people would think of it. There is no problem in slowing down or speeding up when you need it with a nimble weapon like a Montante. The main advantage of a Montante was its reach, impact force and speed. It could beat one-handed weapons like rapiers, mesa and side swords aside and still hit the wielder behind it. This made the Montante a good weapon for bodyguards. The main tactic with a Montante was to keep multiple enemies away and strike those who came into the death zone. When the techniques and reglas were done right, the moves looked too intimidating for the enemies to rush in for an attack or scare them away. You mostly didn't wait for your opponent's attack to react according to it, since if there were more opponents, some of them would attack simultaneously from different angles, which gives you just a little time frame to observe your surroundings. Moving the Montante and yourself in circular motion gave you more opportunities for an oversight of the situation. That's why you seldomly looked for binding weapons, since it simply stopped the death copter of yours. Being able to attack in every direction, the Montante kept a very offensive defense up. But remember, if you faced a single opponent, you fought differently. In this case, you could adapt longsword techniques to your greatsword as well. Godinho shares some good advice for the Montante that isn't even a fencing technique. For example, if you leave at night, carry the Montante without the sheath, or at least with the sheath removed. Be sure that the cloak, hat or sheath doesn't remain in the street, so that no one comes to know of the person who has been there. Because of that, I suggest that at night the Montante is carried without a sheath and the wielder without the cloak, and the Montante in the left hand tilted diagonally and not on the back as many carry it. In the past, the Montante could also be seen in fencing schools held by swordmasters. During lesson, the Montante would be the symbol of the teacher's experience. In the heat of sparring, the teacher would use the Montante to separate his students if he had to intervene. Today, although being a niche weapon in HEMA, the Montante is getting more popular because it looks very elegant, beautiful while moving, and due to its weight of 2.5 kilograms, it is very beginner friendly. At the moment, more and more female HEMAists are catching on Montante fencing, so I hope that future HEMA schools are going to teach more about Montante. If you are interested in Montante videos, go to Tom Pui's channel. He's a very knowledgeable teacher and an experienced instructor for the Montante. Also, I can recommend you to watch Montantero Bond's video on YouTube. He covers most of the greatswords and shows techniques from different fencing masters. In conclusion, the Montante was a weapon for stylish fencing, one against many. Different sources made the Montante a very versatile weapon for dangerous situations to protect yourself or another person. I, for myself, hope to see this weapon and its fluid movements in more movies and video games in future. So, if you liked my brief overview over the Iberian Montante, feel free to like and subscribe my video. I see you next time in Greatswords Around the World Part 3.